I knew I was in trouble the moment I walked into Tattered Tales, the little bookstore wedged between a vegan donut shop and a thrift store that smelled distinctly of mothballs and nostalgia. Originally, I'd just been on a mission to snag a birthday gift for my niece, something sensible, something that screamed, thoughtful aunt, but definitely not a last-minute impulse buy. Only, the usual. The outside of the place looked like it was caught in some kind of whimsical time warp. Fairy lights vaguely sparkled in the window, and a hand-painted sign proclaimed, "Books and wonders await." I'm pretty sure I sighed louder than I intended when the bell above the door jingled. It was the kind of place that smelled like old paper and mystery all at once. As I wandered past shelves groaning with way too many genres, everything from dusty biographies to neon-colored fantasy novels, I caught sight of an odd door at the back. It was tucked behind a crooked bookcase, painted a deep forest green with no handle, just a small, intricate keyhole. Curiosity got the better of me. My fingertips grazed the frame, and suddenly, a folded slip of paper fluttered down and landed in my coat pocket. I swear I didn't see who dropped it. It was like the bookstore had a secret of its own and wanted me to be part of it. Before I could even pull the note out to read it, I felt a tap on my shoulder. The woman who stood behind me was petite and sharp-eyed, with a knowing smile that made me both nervous and intrigued. "Your invitation," she whispered, almost conspiratorial, nodding toward the slip of paper poking out of my pocket. "Lose it." And just like that, the bookcase beside me creaked and swung open, revealing a narrow stairwell leading down into a dimly lit room. I hesitated. Honestly, I was trying to convince myself that this wasn't some kind of elaborate prank, but before I could protest or back away, the woman ushered me inside. The room was smaller than I imagined, lined wall to wall with books, but more importantly, filled with people. A hodgepodge of characters sat in mismatched chairs, an elderly man with a tweed jacket and glasses perched low on his nose, a woman with wildly colorful hair and paint-splattered jeans, a middle-aged man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else but there. And somehow, awkwardly, there was me, the accidental newcomer wearing the look of someone who'd just been dropped into a secret club meeting entirely by mistake. No one said a word at first. I could feel their eyes weighing me, like a mixed bag of intrigue, amusement, and maybe a dash of doubt. I unfolded the invitation in my hand, revealing a single hashed line of words. "Tonight, the story chooses you." What exactly that meant was anyone's guess, but as a door clicked softly behind me and the woman who'd invited me nodded in encouragement, I realized this was not your typical book club. Somehow, somewhere, I'd stepped off the well-worn path and landed squarely inside a mystery of my own, and a very unusual one at that. Now, whether getting roped into secret meetings at a quirky bookstore counts as a great story or a colossal mistake might still be up for debate. But one thing was clear: the moment I crossed that threshold, my boring afternoon errand turned into something weirdly unforgettable. And honestly, I didn't quite know if I was terrified or thrilled. Either way, I was in. Emma emerged from the shadows like a character stepped right out of a gothic novel. But instead of brooding, she had this mischievous, almost magnetic energy that filled the room. She was something like a cross between a librarian, a magician, and that one eccentric aunt who always seems to know more than she lets on. Her hair was a wild halo of curls, peppered with streaks of silver that caught the low light just right, and she wore a cozy sweater that looked like it had survived several literary tempests. "Welcome," she said, her voice warm but with an edge of secrecy that made me lean in a little closer. "I'm Emma. You're officially on the guest list now." Guest list? That sounded even more exclusive than I'd imagined. I blinked at her, still clutching that folded note, the one that now felt like it had magnetized itself to my palm. "It's not your usual book club," she went on, eyes twinkling. "Here, the stories aren't just read, they're lived." That line hung in the air, a mix of promise and challenge. Then came Jake, sliding into the chair beside me with an easy grin that suggested he'd been through this initiation dozens of times and survived. He had the kind of scruffy charm that made you want to listen to whatever he had to say, even if it was about something as strange as this secret society. "So, you're the new recruit?" Jake asked, nudging me slightly with a book that looked ancient but cracked open like a well-used diary. I admitted, with more honesty than pride, that I was probably the least read person here. The irony wasn't lost on me. While everyone else seemed steeped in literature, I was still figuring out how to get through the back of a cereal box without zoning out. But Jake just laughed. "No worries," he said. "This isn't about being a bookworm or a scholar. It's about curiosity, intuition, and a little bit of courage." He leaned closer and, without much fuss, filled me in on the club's secret. This wasn't a place for discussing the latest bestseller or the quirks of classic prose. Instead, they met to solve real puzzles inspired by stories, yes, but very much about their own town. Emma chimed in, hands clasped like someone about to reveal a secret recipe. "Each book, each meeting is a clue. Our community sometimes has mysteries. Odd disappearances, strange sightings, local legends that refuse to die. We use literature to untangle them. The idea sounded like a mix between a puzzle room and the pages of an adventure novel. I found it weirdly thrilling. Despite my lack of literary prowess, something about the promise of real-life mystery sparked a flicker of excitement. I looked around at the group again, those mismatched chairs, the eclectic crowd, and suddenly none of it seemed quite so accidental. Maybe this peculiar, hidden corner of the city was exactly where I was meant to be. That first meeting was a jumble of whispered theories, playful accusations, and cryptic references I barely caught. The elderly man with the tweed jacket who introduced himself as George quoted obscure passages from books like a seasoned detective, his spectacles sliding down his nose as he gestured animatedly. Across the room, the woman with the wild hair, Maya, I learned, sketched furiously in a notebook, adding colorful symbols and notes that seemed to mean something more than just doodles. Meanwhile, the middle-aged man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Tom kept scribbling in his notepad, his brow furrowed so deeply that I worried it might get stuck that way. I tried to contribute but felt like a fish flapping on dry land. My first few attempts at making sense of the puzzle were met with patient smiles and subtle headshakes. Still, when I whispered a guess about a local legend involving an old lighthouse, Jake gave me a knowing look and didn't dismiss me outright. "You're getting the hang of it," he said quietly, and for some reason, that felt like a small victory. Just as the conversation began to settle into a rhythm, a sudden hush fell over the room. Emma moved to a small chalkboard tucked near the back. Quietly, she wrote a new message: "The past remembers what the present forgets." A folded piece of paper slipped from beneath the chalkboard onto the floor, catching my eye. It was a new clue, fresh and mysterious, with a hastily scrawled note: "Look closer, the story isn't finished." I exchanged a glance with Jake, who shrugged with a grin that said, "You're in deeper now." And just like that, what started as a goofy accidental invitation turned into something more. Something I didn't quite understand yet but couldn't wait to unravel. The first meeting was a storm of confusion, curiosity, and a dash of chaos, all simmering under the low glow of those crooked fairy lights Emma had strung up like scattered stars. I sat in one of those mismatched chairs that looked as though it had survived a family of unruly cats clutching a worn copy of the assigned book, a tattered mystery novel that promised more puzzles than answers. Right off the bat, I realized this wasn't about polite discussions or casual opinions. Instead, we plunged headfirst into guessing games, cryptic hints, and references that sounded like they belonged in a secret handshake rather than a book club. George, the elderly man in tweed, was practically vibrating with excitement as he rattled off passages, drawing connections that were somehow both obscure and vital. "See here," he said, peering over his glasses. "The author's choice to mention the old clock tower isn't random. It's a metaphor and possibly a clue." Maya, ever the wild card with her crimson hair and paint-stained fingers, nodded vigorously, flipping pages and sketching symbols in her notebook. "I think the symbol on page 73 matches a carving in the town cemetery," she mused, voice low but intense. Meanwhile, I sat there with my hands sweaty enough to make the book pages stick. When it was my turn to speak up, I swallowed hard and blurted out something about how maybe the story was less about the places named and more about the people who live there, their secrets, their fears. Jake smiled at me as if I'd just cracked some secret code rather than sounded like I was floundering in the dark. "You're not just reading, you're observing," he said, and that small encouragement felt like a lifeline. This was quickly becoming less of a club and more like a live-action puzzle. The stories we read somehow echoed the whispered mysteries of the town disappearances, strange noises in the night, legends that locals either whispered about or tried desperately to forget. Emma explained that each meeting wasn't merely about the book in hand, but the real-world echoes that book inspired. I recall, with a sort of embarrassed fondness, how my first few attempts to tie our current mystery to the town made me sound like a conspiracy theorist armed with half-misremembered trivia from those history podcasts I'd started binging for fun. But to my surprise, the group always met my awkwardness with patience, humor, and sometimes downright cheers when a thread I pulled turned out to be gold. During one part of the discussion, a strange hush fell over the room. Emma stepped forward and wrote in chalk on a small blackboard that hung precariously by one nail, "Truth wears many masks." As if on cue, a folded slip of paper dropped from beneath the board so suddenly it made me jump. The note was brief, cryptic: "Find where words fall silent." The room buzzed with whispered theories. Was it a location? A moment in the book? A cryptic message pointing to something else? At that moment, I caught Jake's eye. His grin was equal parts thrill and, well, this just got real. I felt my heart pound in sync with that unspoken promise. The story was pulling me deeper and there was zero chance of turning back. It hit me, sitting there surrounded by this quirky tribe, that I wasn't just awkwardly tagging along anymore. I was part of this strange dance, each clue, each question, each cryptic turn drawing us closer to something none of us fully understood yet. And just like that, what had started as me awkwardly clutching a book in a room full of strangers morphed into a twisted, tantalizing treasure hunt. Somewhere beneath the layers of words and mysteries, my own story was just beginning to take shape. The evening I watched the little secrets of our town unravel beneath the soft glow of those fairy lights, I realized something. This secret book club wasn't just about stories or puzzles, it was about finding a place where my quirks and curiosities somehow fit right in. We chased that last clue, the one scrawled on the slip that said, "Find where words fall silent," through Emma's labyrinthine bookstore, which by now felt as familiar as my own backyard. The phrase nagged at me like a riddle lodged inside my brain. Where in a bookstore could words fall silent? Books were full of words, and silence felt like their opposite. Jake was already pulling at a stack of dusty, unpublished poetry volumes, joking that maybe the silence was the collective sigh of all these forgotten rhymes. Maya was sketching, George was muttering about cryptic metaphors, and Tom, surprisingly, was now the most animated I'd seen him. It was a cacophony of theories, all leading to dead ends, or so I thought. Then, with a laugh, Emma lifted a thick, leather-bound ledger from a hidden alcove behind the checkout counter. The cover was embossed with faded gold letters spelling Tattered Tales Archives. She smiled like she'd been waiting for this moment, the keeper of a secret just about ready to be shared. "This," she said, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "is where the story really lives." She flipped open the book to reveal pages filled with handwritten notes, old newspaper clippings, letters sent to the store over decades, testimonies of town residents, and sporadic sketches and annotations. This was a tangible history of the curious and the mysterious, a living document of the town's little enigmas. The phrase, "find where words fall silent," suddenly clicked. It wasn't about a place without words. It was this ledger, the stories that were told, recorded, then quietly tucked away, silenced by time but waiting patiently for someone to listen again. Emma invited us to pore over the pages, to connect the dots no one else had bothered to trace. We discovered a small series of unsolved disappearances from decades ago. Names that rarely made the evening news now hinted at a pattern long buried in silence. Our quest shifted from cryptic clues and fiction to piecing together real narratives hidden in those yellowed pages. I found myself reading aloud fragments, each line a pulse beating faintly beneath the dust. What surprised me most was how the group knit itself closer with each discovery. Jake, who'd once teased me about being the odd one out, encouraged my observations. George shared historical context that deepened every snippet we found. Maya's sketches evolved into maps and symbols that tied clues to physical places. Even Tom, well, let's just say he developed a sudden fondness for me that was hard to explain but quietly appreciated. As the night stretched into early morning, Emma's reasoning for keeping this book club a secret became clear. She wasn't just protecting the mystique of the bookstore, she was guarding a fragile sanctuary where stories, both fictional and real, could breathe quietly, away from the clamor of everyday life. In a world obsessed with loud headlines and instant gratification, Tattered Tales was a whispered haven for the curious and the patient. When dawn spilled pale light through the bookstore windows, I looked around at this motley crew of accidental detectives and dreamers. I wasn't the lost visitor anymore. I was a thread in this intricate tapestry. Emma caught my eye and smiled softly. "Sometimes," she said, "the best stories find you when you're not even looking." And with that, I felt like I'd stumbled upon something rare. Not just a secret book club or a treasure hunt, but a community that saw me, valued my awkward questions, and invited me to belong. That night, the mystery of our town felt a little less shadowed, but more importantly, I found a story that was mine to tell. And if anyone asked, I'd say it all started with a locked door, a fluttering slip of paper, and the unexpected magic of a bookstore that believed in secrets worth sharing.